Good evening, everybody. Hello and welcome back. And what another Grand Prix we had. So much to get through tonight. There were so many talking points, so much controversy, so much action, brilliance. As I said in the description, there were mistakes and brilliance in equal measure over the course of this weekend. And the whole lot, combined with some weather and everything else, added up to what I think was a brilliant Grand Prix. Again, 2 Grand Prix in this year and everything's looking great, isn't it? Not only have we got a really tight battle at the front, and it looks like the Verstappen-Hamilton battle is a genuine one. It looks like it might run, and at certain circuits it might favour one team or one driver over the other, but it definitely looks to be clear-cut between those two, and if that continues throughout the season, then brilliant. But even behind them, you know, we've got a midfield battle that is intense and is going to start toing and froing between teams all the way through the year. The team's championship, even right at the front, could well come down to who does better out of Sergio Perez or Valtteri Bottas, and neither of those two yet fully comfortable with their car and performing to the best of their ability. So for me, it's edge of the seat stuff. You cannot look away from the 2021 season, and I think that's just fantastic. I hope you all enjoyed it massively. I've just had a message on Twitter a moment ago from Martin Pickering, who said... Martin Pickering says, could you wait for me? I'm winging it back from Leicester. I'll be home just after 9, so just save the juicy gossip for me until then. So, Martin, yeah, we'll hang on for a little bit. Let's say hello to everyone first. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining again from all over the world. I can see, absolutely brilliant. I love this. I know I say it every time, but it still blows my mind that you keep coming back week after week. Thank you very much. I hope you had a great weekend and a great week. If you saw my Instagram over the weekend, my weekend was filled with discovery in my house. You may see, I've told you that we're doing building work. You might have seen on Instagram that we uncovered all sorts of artefacts down the end of our garden, including a well, a bomb shelter, and now a Victorian water cistern buried underground made out of brick. So some incredible discoveries. So my weekend's been spent digging, covered in dirt up to my eyes, and with a great big grin on my face because I don't know what I'm going to find next. And if you're interested in following that story, my wife's Instagram at The King and I House, at The King and I House. She's documenting the whole story of our house build. So if you are interested in that, go and give her a follow. Anyway, hello and welcome. I hope that Martin Pickering will be back home from Leicester by now, driving safely, of course. So let's get into it. There's so much to talk about, isn't there, this weekend? I feel like, where do we start? Let's start with Imola as a circuit, first of all, because Imola, I still think, despite the fact it's really difficult to overtake, the fact that it's punishing with old school gravel traps, for me, that's great. Yeah, we need to find a way to make sure we can get cars to overtake, but look, that's what 2022 is supposedly designed all around, isn't it? It's around allowing cars to follow more closely, get wheel-to-wheel racing, to not be so adversely affected by the current aero problems that do have that impact. And if we get that out of 2022, for me, Imola is going to be a brilliant circuit. I love the fact that you do get punished if you make a mistake. And in the wet this weekend, there were so many mistakes. And that's exactly what makes a great Grand Prix. We don't want drivers being able to tootle around flat out, you know, without the risk of getting something wrong. We want there to be punishment if you make a mistake, and that is what separates the men from the boys. Look, even the 2 guys who finished on the top 2 steps of the podium this weekend made massive mistakes, and we'll get into those in a moment with Lewis and Max as well. Turn the volume up, you say. Hold on a minute. Let me see. Is that any better? Is that getting louder? Hopefully that hasn't blown somebody's headphones apart if they've had it cranked up to the max already. It's because the mic's a little bit far away. Let me try that. Hopefully sound is okay. I just don't want it too close because it starts to pick up the fan on the computer every time that kicks in. Anyway, what do you reckon then? What do we think of Imola? Last year, I think people thought maybe not so good because it was just so hard to overtake. This year we had a slightly longer DRS zone, which definitely allowed people to get closer and have a little bit more of an attack. So for me, I think it kind of worked. It's definitely not easy, but for all the reasons I've just said, I think it's got a place on the calendar, but I'd love to know what you think. Gravel traps equal track limits, says Jonathan Moore. Couldn't agree more. It's a brilliant way to police track limits, isn't it? My mum watched her first F1 race and tipped Lando as a future world champion, says Novelty Robot. I'd love to know what she thought of her first F1 race. If that was your first F1 race, if you stumbled into Formula 1 this year off the back of Drive to Survive or whatever else, I mean, come on, you must be impressed. You must be hooked after 2 rounds in, right? Thanks, yeah, no worries for turning the mic up, that's fine. The weather made it a banging race, says Josh, and that's another good point. And also, that is definitely a feature of shuffling the calendar around the way we have it right now. Because of COVID, we've had to do things in a different order. We've had to put things like Imola this early in the season when you do start to run the risk of different weather situations. Traditionally, F1's always followed the sunshine, and that's mostly because promoters tend to sell more tickets on sunny days, and so they want it in the sunny season. They want it in the summer because it makes good business sense. But from a racing perspective, having the racing in areas of the world where the weather's a bit unpredictable just adds that other element, that other unpredictable element to a Grand Prix season. So for me, I kind of quite like it. Gravel traps need to be less forgiving, says Can Cracker. Well, do they? So that's a good point. So we had a number of cars going into the gravel and yet they managed to get out of it, which for me is the way it should be. You don't necessarily want someone's race to be ended. You kind of want them to be heavily punished. I mean, Lewis is another case altogether because the red flag bailed him out of all sorts of trouble. As I say, we'll get into that. But drivers going into the gravel trap, you've ruined your lap time if it's qualifying. You've probably lost a whole bunch of places in the race. But if you can continue, it keeps a number of cars in the Grand Prix, which from a spectator perspective is what you want. If you're beached in a gravel trap and stuck, first of all, their race is over. Secondly, it interrupts the Grand Prix. And if that's happening regularly, I think that's perhaps something to be avoided. So it feels about right the way the gravel traps worked this weekend. Gravel traps were great. Punished mistakes without beaching cars, says Lost and Confused. I think I agree with that. In fact, a number of drivers, because of the way the race panned out with weather and then the red flag, a number of drivers went into the gravel trap and yet still made it into decent positions. Carlos Sainz had goodness knows how many... Oh, my phone's going off. Goodness knows how many trips through the gravel trap and yet still ended up with a decent points haul. So, yeah, it was a really interesting race for so many reasons, I think. And I'm glad to see that lots of you still enjoyed it. Where should we start then with the incidents? Shall we start with... What should we start with? I can't remember which order they all came in. Let's start with Lewis's spin through the gravel, his nosing into the wall, and then his subsequent recovery off the back of that. First of all, the incident where he ended up in the wall. A calamity, a comedy of errors. I'm going to blame the whole thing on Lewis, and I think he blamed it all on himself as well. I don't buy the fact that this was George Russell's fault. Yes, the blue flags mean you have to move off the racing line, but he was within his rights to get through that corner and then move off the racing line afterwards. It was Lewis Hamilton's impatience, as he admitted himself, to move off that racing line onto the wet surface that then meant he locked up and disappeared off into the gravel trap. So that was his mistake in the first place. And then what happened, and you really couldn't have made this up, he stopped the car safely away from the wall and I think assumed that he could get enough wheel spin and shuffle the rear end round, but it didn't. The front end just kind of gripped and it launched him forwards and he damaged the nose. But then he had the presence of mind to struggle, take his time to get it in reverse and reverse all the way out. A few people messaged me saying, is it not illegal to reverse back onto the circuit? It's not. The only time reversing becomes illegal in a Grand Prix is if it's done in the pit lane. That's an absolute slam dunk black flag. But no, reversing onto the racetrack from that sort of situation is absolutely okay, as long as you're doing it safely, of course. If you reverse into the path of someone else, that then breaches other regulations. But Ron did I've just seen Ron flying up the screen there. Lewis did a great job of getting that car back, turning his mindset round during the red flag period, getting himself back into the right headspace. And yes, he lucked in with the fact that, you know, he managed to unlap himself because of the red flag situation, something that I still don't agree with as a rule, but there it is. But then once we've had all of that and we get back into racing, you know, his head was down. This is when Lewis really comes alive sometimes. It's when he's often at his best. When he's facing adversity, all right, he's got the fastest car or one of the fastest cars, but he cleanly made it through the field, something that a lot of drivers couldn't do, and got himself all the way back up to second. So for that, you've got to take your hat off to him. That's why he's so great. But the day belonged to Max Verstappen, and that was because he made less mistakes in the moments when it really mattered. So we'll come to Max in a moment. Let's see what you're saying about Lewis's afternoon. Reversing, stopped the nose digging in. It was a very sensible... First of all, it was the only thing he could do because he was buried in a wall, so he had to select reverse. Reverse gear on these cars is not like on your road car. It's a tiny little gear with its own kind of hydraulic actuator, which is used so rarely that, yes, you have to have it. It's in the regulations. You have to test it. You have to show it in scrutineering to the stewards, to the scrutineers, to prove that you have it and have it working. So it's something that we always test inside the garage. You have to make sure every time you fire the car up and you do what we call a shift check, you run through the gears, run through the gearbox up on a high stand, fire it up. Somebody, and this is one of my jobs when I was working on the cars at Mclaren, I had a hold of the steering wheel, or I sat in the car, you fire the car up from behind. You then drive the car essentially with the wheels spinning in the air all the way through all of the gears, come all the way back down to first again, go back to neutral, and then you always select reverse. So it's something that's tested all the time in the garage, but rarely ever used in the realities of out on the racetrack. And that's why sometimes once you've got more load on the car, once the car's beached in a gravel trap, if it's not quite aligned, it sometimes just doesn't clunk into gear. And that's what Lewis was finding. And he had to be very patient to keep trying it, to keep working it, to maybe move forward a little bit and then try it again before he finally got it into gear. That showed quite a lot of composure in a moment that must have been incredibly stressful. And once he'd got it into reverse, you know, as I say, he had the presence of mind to not just reverse away from the wall and then select first, which would have almost certainly spun the tyres and buried him. But he just kept it going backwards, and that's what essentially got him to the end of the race. Let me see. Lewis had an amazing drive that may prove pivotal at the end of the season, says Tom. I totally agree with you. That's one of those moments that you know, it could be the deciding factor. But you can equally say that about the likes of Max, who managed to pull all of that off. Whilst others were failing behind him, he did a strong and amazing job, really, Max Verstappen, over the weekend. Lewis loves the competition. You could see in his eyes in the interview post-race. Yeah, he does. He loves those moments. I'm always reminded whenever I see Lewis doing something like that, of the first time I really saw Lewis in anger racing, which was that Turkish race in his GP2 days. You may have read the story in my book. When I was in the garage at McLaren, he wasn't a McLaren F1 driver then, but he was fighting for the championship with Nelson Piquet and spun early in that race in Turkey. If you haven't seen it, just Google it. And then an incredible drive from pretty much the back of the field. I think he got right up to maybe second, I can't remember, but an amazing fight back. And that was what we saw again on Sunday. Miami, we'll definitely get onto Miami in a moment. So yeah, if you've got any questions, ping those in. Sergio Perez made a dog's dinner of his race. I mean, he kind of did. He did not get the best out of that car. After what was a brilliant qualifying, he just made too many mistakes in the race. And I feel like the same things in terms of the nuances around that Red Bull and how clearly Max has been driving with that for years. He's had the whole thing built around him. It suits Max, or Max has developed a style that suits the car. Other drivers are struggling to cope. So clearly there are some things around that Red Bull car that need a very different way of driving to what seemingly most other cars on the grid. And even someone with the experience of Sergio Perez is finding that this year. The one thing I would say is that Sergio Perez, because of his experience, I have more faith that he will get there and he will unlock the potential. We're seeing it in moments, but just perhaps not consistently enough. But I have faith that Sergio Perez will come on strong. And if Valtteri Bottas is not performing and continues to not perform and starts to lose his head, it could be Sergio, and a resurgent Sergio, that actually ends up being the deciding factor in the championship, as I said earlier. They should have kept Albon. I don't buy that. I think Sergio's got a lot of potential at Red Bull. I think he's, as I say, experience counts for a whole lot. Plus dealing with the pressure that the young drivers finding it so hard to do at Red Bull in that environment. Let me see. Marc, is moving off an F1 car in second gear recommended? Just Trans 1. If you mean the start of the race, it's absolutely fine. It's really no problem at all. And I think you find a lot of drivers did that on Sunday. It's pretty typical in wet conditions just because the torque spike in first gear is so massive. It's almost impossible to not slip the wheels in slippery conditions. And once you've started slipping the wheels too much, to stop that, you've almost got to stop the car. So your start's ruined. So starting in second just gives a much more progressive torque curve in getting the car moving. And once it's away, once it's rolling, you're fine. You can fly through the gears. But it's that launch from a standstill is very different. You find often the same thing in launching out of a pit stop box, particularly in wet conditions. Doing it in second gear is a much better option. So no problem from a technical perspective to do that. Let me see. It's the shortest and the highest rate car. It's very different from the Mercedes, like a Racing Point. Yeah, so you're talking about the Red Bull, absolutely. So very different in terms of its philosophy, in terms of how it produces its downforce with the high rake, and it is very different to what Sergio had at Racing Point. However, before Racing Point switched last year to copy the Mercedes, they were a high rate car as well, quite extreme. So I don't think that's necessarily the sole reason. I think we've had drivers come in and switch between AlphaTauri and Red Bull Racing, both high rake cars over the past few years, and clearly massive differences between the two. So I'm not sure quite what it is, but there's definitely something that makes that Red Bull a little bit more nervous, and therefore the drivers have to really adapt perhaps how they apply throttle coming out of corners and those kind of things, just to suit the car, to suit the characteristics of the car. But an experienced driver perhaps have a better opportunity to do that. What's going on with Aston Martin's brakes? Good point. It seemed like they recovered it, but it did, because it was both cars. It was either that they got the blanking horribly wrong, and by that I mean how much brake ducts you're allowed, you have open for those conditions. But I suspect it was so severe that you'd have to get that massively wrong for that to happen. It was more likely a brake-by-wire problem. Because brake-by-wire is by wire, you can change settings to kind of fix problems. You can switch to a default setting to cure some kind of failure. Now, I don't know the details, obviously, but that seems more likely that was the case. And by changing some settings, they were able to recover the problem once they rebuilt the brakes on Lance's car on the grid. But what a mess between Vettel and his penalty. What a mess in terms of not understanding the rules fully at Aston Martin, in terms of having the wheels fitted to the car with the 15 seconds to go board. That was always something that was drummed into us, that routine of countdown as the minutes tick down towards the start. There are certain procedures you just have to follow. You've got to have your engine fired up by a certain time. You've got to have the wheels fitted. You've got to have everybody clear off the grid by a certain time. And, there's no leeway in that. That's a slam dunk penalty if you get it wrong. And it seems like they just messed that up because of the confusion of getting the car off the grid and into the pit lane. So slight schoolboy error from them, and cost them fairly significantly. But how on earth did it take as long as it took for the stewards to give that penalty to Sebastian Vettel? I mean, we were halfway through the race by the time they gave him a penalty for a start infringement. Bizarre. But there you go. In fact, there you go. JE5. Why did the stewards take so long to issue penalties? Vettel also commented on it, saying it was unprofessional. I don't know is the answer. I don't know why it took that long. Yes, there's other stuff going on, particularly in a wet race, but I still think that's strange. If stewards are having this much difficulty with some of the things they're having difficulty with over the last few years, either it feels like they need better technology or more people to be able to monitor, more scenarios as the race unfolds. We're Formula One. We should be able to cover either of those or both. We should be able to give more technology and more people, if need be, to make sure that we get the very best decisions as quickly and efficiently as possible. But I don't know the answers to why it took so long, but I think the FIA or the stewarding department, along with the race director, they're not having the smoothest time at the moment, and I hope they manage to get on top of that. There was also, by the way, I don't know if you saw this, if anyone picked up on it, I meant to tweet and I forgot. During the recovery of, I think it might have been Latifi's car, but I can't remember, they were under yellow, safety car, wasn't it? They were under safety car, and there was a shot on the TV of the marshals on the gravel track with a crane, or digger dragging the car away as a car came around the circuit. I didn't see who it was, at some considerable speed, because they were trying to catch up the pack. And it was wet, and it threw back so many horrible memories. So, you know, I hope that someone takes a little closer look at that and tries to figure out exactly what went on. I've just realised I'm getting some feedback here, and that is because, bear with me, I'm getting the sound coming out of my own speakers. Hold on a second. Is that better? Yeah, I think that's better. Okay, hopefully you can still hear me and all's good. Right, where are we going next? How was Stroll able to keep his position over Gasly when he cut the corner during the wet period? Another really good point, and this is kind of what I'm saying about stewards. It feels like there's inconsistencies, and I really hate to criticise stewards and the FIA and the race director especially, because they have such a tough job, and everybody, it's like a referee in football, everybody loves to hate them, everyone loves to criticise. We don't know the full story of all of what's going on in that room. However, consistency is all we ever ask for. It's all we want. And absolutely, Stroll cut the corner, and yes, it was at the start, wasn't it, I think? So there's some leeway for that, but you know, I don't get it. I don't understand why that's not being looked at. If halfway through the race they're still looking at an incident with Vettel having his wheels not fitted with 15 seconds to go, why are they not going back to look at moments like that? Anyway, there we go. Right, Varun Sambi. This is a good one that loads of people tweeted me about over the weekend when, who was it, came in for their stop. Excuse me. Varun Sambi. Removing and preparing the steering wheel for a change is work being done to the car. So, the stop-go penalty. That's what it was, wasn't it? A stop-go penalty means you cannot work on the car until 10 seconds is up. Hold on, I've got to have a quick drink. Excuse me. You can't work on the car until the 10 seconds is up. And that's just a rule for the team. Taking the steering wheel off to make a change doesn't count as the team working on the car. That's the driver, you know, operating his own controls as he comes into the pit stop. So excuse me, I'm nearly dying here with something stuck in my throat. So who was it who did that? I can't remember. Who took the steering wheel off the car? Who was it? Whoever it was took the steering wheel off. I can't remember. Who had the 10-second penalty? Perez, thank you. It was Perez took the steering wheel off, but because he took it off himself, that's not the team working on the car. That's him operating the controls. The steering wheel is his thing. And so he's more than able to do that as long as the team don't touch it, don't take it off him. And that was something that I thought was well rehearsed. You know, it was the sensible thing to do. It was efficient. And the moment they got the green light for the 10 seconds to be up, the steering wheel switch happened. It was actually done really slick. These are the sorts of things that do get practiced as a team goes through its pit stop practice regime for those occasions when... thanks, honey and lemon. Thanks, Simon Robinson. Yeah, those are the sorts of things that people practice. You know, we when we're practicing pit stops, you're doing thousands of pit stops over and over again to practice, but you don't just practice the ones that go well. You have to practice the ones that go horribly wrong, like when a driver overshoots the pit box, or if the front jack fails. What do? Because you don't want to have to be making decisions in that moment. You want some muscle memory to kick in and then be able to revert to your default for when that failure happens. And steering wheel changes are one of those things. If there's an issue and the only fix you can think of at the time is to change the wheel, you've got to be prepared for that. Who's going to do it? There's no one spare in a pit stop, so you have to run through a scenario where you can do that, and they did that very, very well. Right. So that's the Perez one. So I think that clears that up, I hope. Could Perez change all the wheels in 10 seconds? That's a very good point. Could he jump out the car doing it all himself? Don't think that one would be let slide, but there we go. Right. The rule book doesn't specify that team can't work can't be done. That's right, work can't be done to the car, but that's not work being done to the car. That's him operating the steering wheel, something he does all the way throughout the race, and the fact that he pulled a different control on that steering wheel to remove the latch is just neither here or there. That's not work being done to the car, so that was absolutely fine. When will Stroll get more respect? He keeps Bottas behind him for 30 laps. I'm going to agree with you on that. I think Stroll does deserve some respect. I think he is not necessarily a top tier driver, but he's still quite young. I think he has some brilliant moments. And look, we've seen some of those, haven't we? Both in qualifying and in races. And I think his challenge is getting that done consistently. That's what the very best drivers are able to do. They're able to do it week in, week out. The thing that was most surprising about Lewis Hamilton's mistake on Sunday was that he doesn't make mistakes. And that's what shocked everybody. That's why he's a great driver, because he's consistent. And the same with Max. All right, Max does have the occasional spin, but it's rarely ever in a moment when it matters. He has the spins in practice, and occasionally he might have one in qualifying. Let's talk about Max's spin, because Max's spin this weekend in the restart was so close to potentially being his race over. First of all, because he spun and he could have hit something or stuck in himself in a gravel trap. But secondly, the fact that he managed to retain position, the fact that Leclerc backed off, I think out of a little bit of panic, and didn't just blitz past. He says because Max had part of one wheel still on the racetrack, and therefore he wasn't sure whether he could actually overtake or not. I think the instinct, the killer instinct of a Lewis Hamilton in that moment would have been to get past him, and then argue about it later. But Leclerc, his instinct was to perhaps hold back, was to just, he wasn't quite sure what he should do, so he thought he'd stick with second place. But that moment was pivotal in Max retaining the lead, getting his composure back, getting some heat back into his tyres, and getting the run off the restart that meant he could run away from Lewis. So when Lewis did make his way through, Max was so far up the road it didn't matter anymore. It wasn't a spin, it was a power slide for the extra style point. Well, Toby Starr, I'd give him a point for that. I would consider it just drifting, not a spin. Yeah, okay, all right. It wasn't a spin, but it was a mistake nonetheless. And it could have been a very, very costly one. Will Bottas need a new chassis, do you think? I don't know obviously I don't know because I haven't inspected it. But there was a lot of damage. That was a high-speed collision. It was a big, big crash. Toto Wolff suggested that the car might be destroyed. After an accident at that speed, and particularly if he had a big impact, I don't know what sort of G-forces the impact were between cars, and then when Valtteri hit the wall as well. So those things will all matter, but the chances are the team will probably want to replace that chassis with one out the pool, a spare one, for next time out. The interesting thing about that is that if that chassis is a write-off, let's say, if it is destroyed, you then got a tough decision to make, because do you set about manufacturing another brand new chassis so that you still have the same number of chassis in the pool for the season, or do you take the risk of maybe having your spare that you've already got, or two spares, or whatever it is you've got in the system, and assuming or hoping that will get you through the season? If you have to go to the trouble of manufacturing a new chassis, a new tub, there's huge expense in that. That's probably the most expensive part, or certainly one of the most expensive parts of the car that the team make to manufacture and create. And we're in a budget cap scenario this year, so anything like that, crash damage, has to come out of your budget. There's no special allowance for crash damage components. You've got £145 million, and if you end up spending 45 million of that after a series of massive crashes all throughout the season, that takes away from your budget at the end of the day, and that limits the number of upgrades you can bring, and it might limit all sorts of other things that you can do as a team. So it can be significant. I don't imagine that Mercedes, this is going to become a regular thing, but if you think about Haas, all right, they're not anywhere near the budget cap, but still the accidents that are happening at Haas, because they've got two rookie drivers, are desperately eating into their budget. And whether they've got an opportunity to go to the Mazepin family and ask for more money, if that's the case, maybe, but these things have a serious and significant impact on the overall running budget of a team. Hold on, where are we? Leclerc should have passed him. So back to the Max Verstappen. Leclerc should have passed him. What was he thinking? That's the Edge F1 says that. I kind of agree with you. I think he should have done. I think a killer instinct should have kicked in there and he should have gone for it. But Charles Leclerc at that point, don't forget, is really happy to be sitting in second place. If I think that's where he was at the time. He's way further up the order than he thinks he deserves to be. So he's not desperately chasing the win. All right, you think all drivers should be desperately chasing the win at all times, but you know he's in a great position for his team. So playing it safe in that regard, maybe is what he was thinking. What's the approximate cost of a new tub? I don't know. I can't really answer that because it does depend on a huge number of things. It depends, you know. Obviously, you're making it in house for most people. At Haas, they don't do that. They actually subcontract it out to Dallara, so they will have an invoice. If they have to ask for a new tub, they'll get an invoice from the Dallara company. But for most teams, they're manufacturing it in their own in-house, and therefore, you know, it's a cost of materials, but it's time, and it's also time that it takes away from creating other components. The machines are going to be tied up for a long period of time. It's a big component, one of the longest lead time components, and if your big machines are tied up manufacturing a new chassis, a new tub, you're not making other components, whether it's for this year's car or next year's car or whatever, as we move down the line. Killer instinct kicked in with George and everyone's crying him down. Right, Rondell Furlong. Let's move on to the George Russell, Valtteri Bottas moment. We've got to cover that. So, killer instinct kicked in with George and everyone's knocking him for it. Is that the case? Definitely killer instinct kicked in. I love to see it. I think we love that when drivers are brave enough to make the move rather than play it safe. That's what, as an entertainment sport, that's what we want. In that particular moment, what happened was his killer instinct was an overriding factor above any sort of experience telling him that there's one very narrow dry line on that racetrack, and the moment he steps off that, first of all, he's on a wet part of the racetrack. But particularly in that moment, as the circuit kinks round, we're not on a straight, don't forget. The circuit kinks round. So the natural line is for the car, as you go round the left-hand kink, for the car to drift over to the right-hand side, which is what happened with Valtteri. And George then found himself, I don't think he actually ran out of road, but I think he was freaked out a little bit and tweaked the steering wheel just as he saw Valtteri moving over, a wheel on the grass, and we know what happened. So he put himself in a risky situation. Now, I don't really want to criticise him too much for doing that because sometimes those risks pay off. And as a young driver, these are the moments you kind of learn and you base your life experience off. Don't want to peg George back too much for making that move. Should Valtteri have seen him coming? Maybe. And if Valtteri had been a bit more aware that George was coming up on his right-hand side, maybe he doesn't move over so much, but I don't think there was ever a moment where Valtteri moved over to the point where there wasn't a car's width. So it's well within the rule book. He was well within the rules. I just think George got a little bit freaked out when the car started to move over as it went around the left-hand kink, and he overcompensated. And his inexperience, because it was wet, dipping a wheel onto the grass was all it took for a millisecond to spin the wheels up and launch him into the side of Valtteri's car. So what do you think? Was someone to blame? I think it's just a racing incident personally, but I think George will learn from it and put it down to experience, and maybe on another day he'll do things a tiny bit differently. Bottas's move over on him, all his fault. Are you saying it's Bottas's fault because he moved over? I don't think necessarily he moved over in a defensive way, and even if he did, he definitely left the regulation width more than between himself and the edge of the racetrack. So I don't think you can blame Bottas for doing anything untoward, in my opinion, anyway. Jason Morgan says, I think DRS is to blame. Makes the car faster than it should and be unstable when it touches the grass, spinning him off. DRS was not to blame. DRS was part of the reason that the impact was so significant when he did touch the grass. It's not to blame. George Russell knew his DRS was open, and that's one of the reasons he was able to make the move in the first place. There's no way you can blame DRS. You can blame the driver putting his car in that situation, putting his wheel on the grass. There's no one else to blame for that. DRS was just a feature that exacerbated the effects of what George did with his car. George was in the wrong, says Sophia McGlade. I think he probably, if you really need to apportion blame, I think there's a little bit more on George's side than there is on Valtteri's, but for me, racing incident. Bad how Russell handled it post-race. I agree with that. And I think you've probably seen today, he came out with a very kind of long and heartfelt Instagram post to apologise on behalf of his actions post-race, which that's I think that's probably the sort of guy George is. He's had time to reflect on it. He's probably had a lot of people telling him, including Toto Wolff, that what he said and did afterwards was unacceptable. And if George has any hopes of representing Mercedes in the future, he had no choice but to come out and apologise, as he did today. So, that's my opinion on that. You got a lot of drivers, particularly in the latter stages of their career, when that would have happened, there's no way they would have come out and apologised for their actions. They would have stuck firmly saying that's what they believed. But there you go, that was George, and I think, we all know he's generally a nice guy at heart. He just made some mistakes in the heat of the moment. Let me see. George was in the wrong after the crash. Yeah, I think we can agree on that. Bottas' fault for being P10. Well, that's another good argument. There's no way that Valtteri Bottas should, in any regular circumstance, be fighting George Russell in a Williams. The similarities end with the fact they've got the same engine. Those cars are worlds apart from each other in terms of performance. And fair play to George, he'd found his way up to a decent position in the race, but Valtteri should have never been in that situation. And look, let's quickly talk about Valtteri, because he's getting a lot of grief over the last couple of weeks, and particularly after this weekend, and rightly so. He hasn't performed, but the difference between performing as a Valtteri Bottas or anybody else and not can be a couple of degrees of tyre temperature. And for whatever reason, this is no excuse for Valtteri, because it's his job over the course of the practice sessions and then qualifying and then into the race to understand how to get the tyres in the right temperature, as it is for everybody. But if you're not within those few degrees, a couple of degrees out, and it negatively transforms the performance of your car, and you can look like you're driving a Haas, even if you're in a Mercedes. If the tyres on a Williams are switched on and the tyres on a Mercedes are not, that Williams will be as quick, if not quicker. That's how much difference it can make. And Valtteri has to find a way to consistently get and then keep those tyres in the right window if he's got any hope of showing what he can do in that car. Was the pace of George Russell to be appreciated? It's encouraging for Williams. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, Williams have taken a big step forward, both with the car performance, but also with Jos Capito coming in, some of the other appointments they've made, the finance they've now got. This is a team that's very early in its rebuild stage, but already showing positive signs. And for next year, where we get a big reset, now that they're putting the right building blocks in place, they could, really start to fight back, which is great. Everyone would love to see them get back into it, I think. Bottas 3.0 is broken already after one race. He's going to find it very hard, isn't he? I think Valtteri, knowing him a little bit like I do, I don't think he's necessarily bulletproof in the mental state. He spends a lot of time, puts a lot of work getting himself into the right mental state. In the beginning of a season, for example, where we've seen that aggression come out in the first races over previous years. But I also think he's very quick to lose that when things start to go wrong or people start talking negatively about him. So I hope he can find a way to turn that around, because no one wants to see him disappear in a sort of blaze of kind of embarrassment. I don't think anyone wants to see that for him. So I hope he can manage to swing things around. And it is, of course, very early in the season. Jos Capito, excellent choice, says G. Thompson. Couldn't agree more. Brilliant choice. Wherever he ended up in Formula One, it was going to be a lucky team. If you listen to, I think, the last episode or two of my podcast, I talked about the effect he had when he came into McLaren in his early days. Go and listen to the podcast if you want to know more, but had a huge impact, left a huge impact, even though he was only there for a short period of time. Is a wet track an equaliser for the lesser performance teams? Yeah, it can be, because it provides, first of all, a big challenge in terms of tyres. So on a dry track, where everyone knows you're basing the car on its aero performance, on its engine performance, and then how the drivers can get the tyres in the right operating window to get the performance out of them. In a wet track, that's totally different. The game's changed. You haven't got anywhere near as much data. Temperatures are different, and absolutely, you're not going at such speed. You're not reliant so much on engine outright power or aero performance in the same way. And tyre temperature is a whole different game altogether on wet tyres, and in those temperatures where you have a drying track, changing conditions. It really does open up opportunities for the teams that are not normally have the pure pace in dry conditions to get up there. So it's brilliant. I love it when we get a wet race, or particularly a changing condition race like we had. One thing I've taken away from Sunday's race is that Hamilton and Verstappen are on a different level, says POS. Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think those two at the moment are shining, certainly in the cars they've got. I mean, I think there's other drivers. I think I always rate Daniel Ricciardo as one of the top tier drivers, even though he hasn't quite yet got to grips with that McLaren. I think he's definitely up there. I think both Ferrari drivers could equally be brilliant when the car comes right. I think Lando has massive potential. I think George Russell has potential to be a top tier driver as well. So at the moment, with the equipment they've got, there's nobody that can get anywhere near Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, especially both of their teammates. Hang on. What we got here? What were your race predictions? Did you foresee the race results? Says Curtis Grisdale. If any of you that are doing have got the Seed Stream app and are taking part in the free predictions league that we're running on that at the moment, if you get on there and have a look, I am doing terribly. Out of 2 races, with the potential of a maximum of 12 points from the 2 races, I've got 1 point. So what we do, for those who don't know, on the Seed Stream app, every race from 1 week before the race start, the predictions opens up so you can pick the top 5 for the race, and you can change it over the weekend up until an hour before the race start. You just drag your drivers into the top 5 positions, and I've got 1 place out of picking the top 5 for 2 race weekends. I've got 1 right. I've got a 5th place for Perez in the first round. That's it. So in answer to your question, my predictions are going terribly. I'd love to know if any of you have done any better than me, because it's actually harder than it seems. When we looked at setting up this predictions thing in Seedstream, we thought, well, isn't it going to be really easy? Because, it's going to be Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas, Max Verstappen. It's not. Even just trying to pick the top 3, getting them in the right order is harder than it seems. But there you go. We shall continue on that one. Let me see. George threw away some good points. Not a good look. Yeah, we've covered that. It wasn't his finest hour. What else? Thoughts on Miami? Should we cover Miami? Let's cover Miami. I'll show. I've got the picture of the circuit here, which is the only bit of prep I've done for today. So apologies. There you go. Have a look at that for those who haven't seen it. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. A 10-year deal for F1 to race in Miami, the Miami Grand Prix. It's going to be around the stadium in Miami. There, it's a street race, but not your typical street race. It's got a sort of bespoke circuit that's not dictated just by the streets, because they're running through the car park and the surrounding grounds of this big sports stadium there. So the circuit, to me, looks interesting. It's got enough interest for us not to write it off. And I know that, people are saying it's a car park Grand Prix. It's never going to be great. It's not a traditional circuit. But I'm not sure about this. I think let's give this a chance. It's got some corners that potentially can offer something. And I think that's what we have to cling on to. And particularly, let's remember that this is coming in next year when the cars are different. And in theory, at least, we've got this whole idea that cars can follow each other more closely and race each other wheel to wheel. If that all works out as we hope, this circuit, I think, could be a really fantastic one. It could be an interesting one. And a great addition to bringing F1 back to America on a grander scale. 2 races in the States. It's a hugely untapped market in the most part. And I know that many of you watching right now are in the States. I'd love to hear from you what you think of this. you know, it's another race on your time zone. It's another race in your part of the world that you might have an opportunity to go to. So what do you think? Can we break America? Love to know your thoughts on that. You know, the Formula One has had a long and torrid relationship with America in that it's had good spells, but most of the time it's had bad or indifferent spells. The race in Austin, I think, has been brilliant. It's an amazing racetrack. It's an amazing city. You know, we love going there as a fraternity of Formula One. I think it provides a great TV spectacle, but it hasn't yet captured the imagination of the whole of America. And I'm not saying the Miami Grand Prix will do that, but by increasing the exposure we have over there, we increase the opportunity or the chance for that to happen, I would say. The bottom sweeping straight looks good. It does. Let's put the track back on so you can see that while I read these. Indianapolis. Yeah, I mean, I used to love going to Indy. I used to go to high school with the guy that helped to put the Miami GP together, says Lotus 98. Well, good. I hope that you're still in touch and you can get some inside info on that. But I'm pleased they've managed to put the deal together. I actually like Kota, says Corolla Roo. I do too. I think it's a great one. Really, really cool. 3 hours from my house, says Zetro Garage. I love it. Great, that's good for you. Miami brings the celebrities out. Yeah, I mean, if you're into that, that's cool too. Is it an IndyCar track? Not at the moment, but I wonder if it could be at some point. Let's hope Haas get to race there. That's a good point. I'm still very much unconvinced about the future of the Haas Formula One team. I'm not sure how much longevity they've got in their life, but I hope so. I hope they get to exploit that for their own benefit. There's no tradition of F1 in America. Absolutely not. Well, there is actually. There is tradition of F1 in America. It goes a long way back, but it's not recent tradition. But if you want to create tradition, you've got to start somewhere. So maybe this is it. Through the stadium is a great idea. Yes, that would be cool. What happened to the Grand Prix of New York? I'll tell you what happened to the Grand Prix of New York. It went the same way as the Grand Prix of London. Almost certainly never going to happen because the logistics of doing it, apart from anything else, the cost of doing it are just almost prohibitive. And on top of that, trying to create a circuit through the streets of London or New York is not very easy. Certainly not a circuit that would lend itself to creating a good spectacle. So if we can't create at least a half-decent track in a city, do we want to go there? Is it worth our while? I don't think so. For me, New York was never going to happen unless you can move it out of the city. And I know they looked at that as well. F1 in London also, whilst I'd love to see it, racing around the landmarks of the capital of this country would be amazing. I just can't see it ever happening. Nobody wanted to pay for the New Jersey track, same as Miami. Nobody will pay, race will not happen. Well, I think we're over that now. I think we've got a solution to that, so that hopefully won't be an issue. Money is always what is the biggest factor in making these things happen or not, but to sign a 10-year deal and announce it like this, I think we've overcome those ones. Which month would this be on the calendar? I don't know yet. I'm not sure I've seen that. Has that been announced? I'm not sure. If anyone knows, shout it out. Might be good for Haas. A lot of Americans will have missed all the bad publicity surrounding Mazepin. Yeah, I hope, as I say, I hope Haas can really exploit that to their advantage. They need a break, and if having a home race or a race in the States will give them some kind of help financially, in marketability, then great. Let's hope so. And New York was tanked due to noise restrictions, says Rob Farmer. Yeah, I think that was one of the many problems. As I say, same with London. That's going to be a challenge all the way through. Miami, great location, but not a racetrack. Well, we'll see. Let's see. Let's reserve judgment on whether it's going to be a great race or not until it happens, because I've seen so many racetracks. Formula E is typical for this. You look at Formula E tracks on a bit of paper and they look awful. Most of them look awful. And yet we've had some of the most incredible racing in Formula E in the centre of cities on the streets. So if the cars are right, if the cars are working well and lend themselves to racing on a circuit like that, there's no reason it can't work. So let's see. Okay, let's talk about second quarter of the season for Miami. Says Drew Vasinanen. If that is true, then there you go. Second quarter. So what's that going to be? That's going to be somewhere around sort of May, isn't it? May, June time, probably. We'll see. Everyone wants to talk about Lando. Should we talk about Lando Norris? What a great weekend he had. What a great race he had. Qualifying, again, perhaps not his finest hour. And he was so down on Saturday night, wasn't he, after the mistake with track limits and having his, what would have been a great lap time, taken away. He felt like he'd let the team down. Well, he made up for it on Sunday. A brilliant, brilliant drive. I honestly thought they'd made the wrong call, starting on the soft tyres, because, look, I thought the DRS was powerful enough to enable overtaking a little bit more easily this weekend. And so, given that they were going to run to the flag, I thought the soft tyre was the wrong one, but it wasn't. It was the right call because he made a jump at the start using the extra grip of those soft tyres, made up places, and then when he got there for the large part, he managed to hold people behind, even Lewis Hamilton for quite some time. So really solid race. He's growing into quite a mature driver. You can see it happening. He's only a young kid and he's incredibly immature in so many ways, and I love him for that. But when it comes to driving now, he's starting to pick up the elements that mature drivers have, the experience, the leading the team, the leading decisions in the team, the keeping it on the straight and narrow when he has to, pushing when he has to, but holding back when he has to, looking after tyres. Key skills in Formula One that only ever come with experience, and he seems to be getting that. So great stuff from him. I fully believe Daniel Ricciardo will also be up there in that mix with him. If you think about his Renault journey, Daniel got to Renault and took a few races to figure that car out, but I think he will. I think he will figure it out, and I think he'll find himself that him and Lando will be on the same part of the track quite often, and that, as long as they don't hit each other, can only benefit a resurgent McLaren. So really great to see the guys having stuff to celebrate again over the course of the weekend in orange. Really good. Let's see. Everyone likes Lando. They do. Lando has won the midfield battle in 4 of the last 5 races. Yeah, good point. He's doing really, really well, isn't he? Track position's king. Definitely seems like the best decision now from McLaren. Well, on that circuit, it was the best decision. I'm not sure it's necessarily would be the best decision everywhere. Track position is king in Imola, but on other circuits, it definitely won't be. But we'll see. But great to see them making the right calls. That's a good point. Why aren't McLaren a works team? They're not a works team because they want to be an independent team. They are McLaren. They've never been a works team. They are the McLaren works team. Let's not forget McLaren are a automotive manufacturer in their own right. So they don't want to be somebody else's works team. They'd love to have a works engine deal like they had with Mercedes back in my days, and how they had with Honda in more recent times. It didn't work out. But they're never going to be a works team because they are a works team, just their own. McLaren versus Ferrari fight's going to be interesting. I fully agree with you. That whole midfield battle, front end of the midfield, is going to be brilliant, I think. I still think we might see more out of AlphaTauri as we get Yuki Tsunoda gains experience. They didn't have the best weekend this weekend, but that car's fast in certain circumstances. Will teams copy McLaren's rear diffuser approach? Don't know. Maybe. I'm not. I think certain teams, if bringing a new floor is part of your upgrade plan, if you are bringing upgrades, it's one of those things that not too difficult to incorporate, and if it works for you in your simulations, it's not too hard to incorporate it in a new design. So we could well see something like that. Absolutely. And there is lots of work, of course, going on the floor edges. And actually, it's interesting to see a lot of the floor edge designs, because of the new regulation change, we have that cutout, they're starting to converge a little bit, or a lot of teams are starting to converge on this design where instead of having the triangular cutout on the rear floor, which the regulations prescribe, they're now taking a little bit more floor away. They didn't have to, but they are, to get another parallel edge. So a little bit like they had, just a little bit further in towards the centre line of the car, because having that parallel edge gives you a little bit more scope to control the vortices that spin up off the edge of that, and how you can therefore use that to seal the diffuser and the tyre squirt away from the underside of the car. So interesting seeing that development play out as people start to figure it out and learn it, and everyone just starting to come to some more similar conclusions on that one. Can we talk about the start battle between Hamilton and Verstappen? Who was in the wrong? Nobody was in the wrong. It was great racing. If anyone had got penalised for that, I would have been up in arms, because that's the kind of race we want off the start. It's the first lap of the race. There's no way you can start asking drivers to go, oh, after you. No, after you. We don't want that. We want drivers banging wheels, going hard at it into a chicane, and that's what we got. And both drivers gave each other just about enough, and Lewis came off worst, but that's because he got a worse start. Max got an amazing start and he made the most of it. He was aggressive. Lewis was aggressive in his fight back. The two best drivers on the grid right now going wheel to wheel. Don't any steward ever step in and stop that kind of racing. There's my opinion. No one was wrong. It was great racing and both got away with it. And look, they ended up first and second at the checkered flag. Can McLaren build their own engines? This is the ongoing question. Of course they could, it's possible, but now it makes zero sense because the investment required to do that would be enormous. The only time that might become a possibility is if we suddenly change dramatically the architecture of an engine and change to a new set of regulations. Then you might have the opportunity, when the playing field is much more level, to come in with building your own technology. But the investment is astronomical to do that. And so it makes very little sense in a world where we're now cutting back, saving money to go ahead and do that. And given that 2025 and beyond now look like we're not going to be changing the architecture of the engine too much, it's more going to be centred around sustainable fuels and that kind of thing, I really think there's no point in doing it, because everyone else would have such an advantage. You'd be spending hundreds of millions of dollars and still having to play catch up for a long period of time just to get on a level playing field with everyone else. So makes no sense. Right, a couple of minutes to go. Who's the best driver right now? You can't ask that question. That's the question that there is no answer to. Who's the best driver right now? And I'll tell you why there's no answer to that. The only way, and this comes from experience, the only way you have a genuine opinion of a driver and how good he is when you've worked with that driver. And the reason I say that, for the same reason I said about Valtteri Bottas. Valtteri Bottas looks like a kind of middle of the grid driver, a lower class driver at the weekend. He's not. He's a great driver. He's won Grand Prix. He's a driver that's capable of amazing things, and yet so many circumstances that we're not aware of. Could be damage to a car, could be the wrong settings onto a car, it could be that tyres have dropped out the tyre temperature window, and that affects everything to do with the driver's performance, and along with a number of other elements that we just don't know. And rating a driver is all about how he works with the team, how he works, in the car, outside of the car, how meticulous he is in looking for opportunities, looking through data. There are so many things that make a great driver, and that's why it's impossible to judge. I have an opinion of the drivers that I've worked with, and unsurprisingly Lewis comes out on top of that one. But that's as far as I can give it, and that opinion is not valid anymore because Lewis has moved on, working with, for years now, developing as a human and also as a driver. So I can't even have enough of opinion to judge Lewis as a driver or Max, because I only see them on the television as you do. I speak to people, they give me their opinions, but that's not my opinion. So I can't say who's the best driver. It's an impossible question. Thank you for the time. We've got 1 minute. Sorry I can't answer that. It's not me sitting on the fence. It's just an impossible one to answer. Who's to say that George Russell would not be classed as the best driver on the grid if he wasn't put in a Mercedes and we could see what he did every week? Right, it is 10 o'clock, which means we've come to an end, and I would love to give my opinions on all of the questions still coming through about Sebastian Vettel, about Kimi Raikkonen, about the safety car. I'm really sorry, but I've got to stop because there is a very cold beer in my fridge and I'm about to go and crack it open. But have a wonderful week, guys. I will see you this time next week. No Grand Prix, but I'll see you very, very soon. So have a great one. Keep the questions coming. I'll try and answer them as best I can. And I'll see you soon. Ta-da!